ženama dječjim, rasti i cvijetaj zemljo radnih ljudi. I neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napuči i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode,
was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see in the Prince of Wales. He said to me, come and join the British Army. Tooraloo, they're looking for monkeys up at the zoo. It says, one, if I had a face like you, I'd join the British Army. Sarah Connon baked a cake and so for poor old Slattery sake, sure I threw myself into the lake pretending I was balmy. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army. Sergeant Healy went away and his wife got in the family way, and the only words that she could say was blame the British Army. Tooraloo, me curse upon the Labour blue that took me darling boy from me to join the British Army. Corporal Sheen is a terrible note, just give him a couple of jars of stout and he made the enemy with his mouth and saved the British Army. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me to get home to you and the British Army.
Hello everybody and welcome along. I hope you enjoyed that musical compilation there. There was, as Morgan notes in the chat, quite a switch in the musical style, but I think you will all agree that that song as performed by the Dubliners is very appropriate for this evening's topic of discussion, which is of course Rishi Sunak casting himself in the role of Lord Kitchener and saying that he wants you to, well, surrender your children to him or something like that. But as we will unpack during the course of the next hour or so, this isn't quite the proposal it looks like it is. There are various reasons why that it is not as it first appears, and there are various reasons why this is not the march of the great British Empire to stagger into Crimean War Part 2 with the Russians. And I will explain my reasoning for this over the course of this program. But before we get underway with the discussion, I will add something into the mix here, which is when discussing British defence policy, I think that the old classic series Yes Minister, which remarkably enough is over 40 years old now, it has something to tell us about this. So if you'll permit me and indulge me here, I will elucidate this point by adding to this discussion with the magisterial talents of a certain Nigel Hawthorne.
How's the Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury?
Sleeping peacefully, sir.
Bernard, we have a problem.
Who has?
You and I, Bernard, and the whole of Whitehall. The problem is the Prime Minister's disastrous new defence ideas. Cancelling Trident, reintroducing conscription, and all that rubbish.
The grand design.
Yes, I believe that's what he calls it.
But if it saves money and reduces unemployment...
Bernard, what is the purpose of our defence policy?
To defend Britain?
No, Bernard. Is to make people believe Britain is defended.
The Russians?
Not the Russians, the British! The Russians know it's not. It's for all our simple, ignorant people shuffling in and out of houses, buses, factories, and the cabinet room. The aim of the defence policy is to make them feel secure.
But if there's a better way...
Bernard, we have a magic wand. It is called Trident. Nobody understands anything about it, except that it will cost £15 billion, which means it must be wonderful. Magic. All we have to do is write a cheque, and then we can all relax. But if people in government start talking about it, do you know what will happen?
No.
In the end, they'll start thinking about it. They will come to realise the problems, the flaws in the reasoning. The nation will get worried. Agitation, questions, criticism. Change.
Change?
Change.
Yes, Harvey, there is one thing, though. This TV broadcast he's doing, suppose he uses it to...
Right, so I wanted just to play that to you to set up some of what I'm about to say here, because I think that the great Anthony Jay, the man who wrote that series, captured something important about British defence policy post-1960, which is it's about looking as if you're doing something whilst actually doing something else entirely. Now, of course, you will perhaps know by now that the inspiring, the great, the most magnificent leader that the British bourgeoisie have ever had, a certain Mr. Rishi Sunak, in hot competition with the next best leader the bourgeoisie have available to them, Sir Keir Starmer, trying to reinvigorate his already disastrous election campaign, announced over the weekend that he was going to bring back national service. Now, this is an idea which comes up, roughly speaking, every 15 to 20 years or so in British politics, and he's usually swept under the rug pretty quickly. It's a little bit more serious this time around because of the nature of the times that we are in. But I want to show you what the rather short-term motivations are for Sunak in doing this, and it's nothing to do with defence of the country, and everything to do with his own personal and his party's electoral position. But the actual truth is that he's doing this for very cynical reasons, which doesn't necessarily mean that it won't lead to bad things in the future, but we will be exploring as to why he's done this now. So I'm sharing with you a story that was in the Financial Times the other day. And Sunak's reasoning for bringing this in, of course, is a bunch of garbled nonsense. He's saying that he's justifying it by saying there's China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. These things aren't just happening far away; they impact us here at home. Now, of course, there's truth and lies in that statement. The idea that any of those countries have any interest in invading Britain is, of course, transparent garbage. But what he's trying to say, and this is something he keeps coming back to and sort of alluding to, is that somehow these wars overseas will have an impact here, and he says it'll divide us at home. What he actually means is, of course, that British imperialism is losing the game. They are being threatened in their territories they have dominated in a neo-colonial fashion since the 1950s by the growing assertiveness of the countries involved, and by the fact that the Western bloc, the US imperialist bloc, is visibly losing the war in Ukraine and is losing its influence, and has been for a number of years in actual fact. It's just crystallized over the last two. So there is some truth in what he says there, but he's not presenting it in a truthful fashion. He won't come out and say openly, not yet anyway, that it's all about preserving access to markets and resources and sources of labour to exploit. He'll sort of allude to it's about British influence, but he won't really say what British influence, which is why, of course, he's only keen on debates as long as he can have them only with Keir Starmer, who, of course, will agree with everything he says. So the idea being that he has floated so far is that the British Army will have its fading ranks renewed with fresh batches of 18-year-olds every year. And the choice that the said 18-year-olds will have before them is either do a period of time in the British Army or go and do their service with the public sector. So sometimes police, sometimes fire, sometimes civil service or health service. And of course, the latter part of this, the public sector part of this, is a tremendously cynical ploy to try and paper over the cracks in staffing in these agencies by having a bunch of unpaid 18-year-olds go and do it. So that's the cynical side, one of the cynical sides of this. The other cynical side of this, and here we go back to the article again, is that, of course, the Financial Times admits that only 10% of 18 to 24-year-olds back year-long compulsory military service. This compares with 46% of those aged 65 and above, who would be unaffected by the measures so far, but look who's Ukraine's sending in, but by the measures, but are a core conservative demographic. Now, that's the point to bear in mind here. So, your average 18-year-old is not too keen on getting his bollocks blown off for Britain, which I don't blame them, to be completely honest. But, of course, petty bourgeois pensioners, those over the age of 65, they're rather keen on the idea. They're rather keen on the idea of the youth being marched off around a parade square and then marched off to war. Now, bear in mind, national service in this country, to have actually done it, you would have to be 82, or at the youngest now. National service in Britain was done away with in 1960. My late uncle was in the last group to do it, and they stuck him in a base job over in what was then called Malaya. So he was there in 59 to 60, and he was born, I think, 40 or 41, if I remember it correctly. So he was like the last to do it, last generation to do it. So to do it, to remember it now, you'd have to be in your 80s. So most of these bozos who are questioned about it, telegraph readers mostly, the overwhelming majority of them are these sort of petty bourgeois harumphers. You know, if you wanted to be more crude about it, you'd call them flag shaggers, who would happily march anybody else off to war. But the majority of them, 9 out of 10 of them, have never been near a gun in their lives. Have never been near the military in their lives. Military service in this country, like most of Western Europe now, is confined to a very small minority of the population. Like if you come from a working class area, you're more likely to know people who served, because a lot of people who I went to school with ended up in the military in one form or another. Most of them as regular private soldiers, because it was the only profession that would have them, essentially. This was in the late 90s and early 2000s. But most of the people who will be rabidly in favour of this idea won't have served at all. Now, so that leads us to the substance of the idea. What is it really all about? And the Financial Times touched on it in that article just I was sharing with you just then, which is it's very popular with the core Conservative Party vote. And this is one of the big reasons Rishi Sunak will have done it. He's not a guy who thinks particularly deeply. None of them are. But he'll be told by his advisors that this is a good way of securing a good turnout for the Tory party vote. Now, the Conservative Party, as the polls indicate, though I'm going to come to the way the polls are inaccurate in just a moment, is in a significant amount of trouble. It's not that they are going to lose as badly as the polls say, but they are going to lose. So, okay, again, according to stories in the Financial Times and also in the Times covered this as well, the Murdoch press covered it. The idea of the Tories is that they're not aiming to win. They're aiming to fight a defensive election to retain as many of their seats as they can, particularly in the core areas of the country. And to do that, they need a solid turnout of the Tory voting base, which is petty bourgeois, small business types who are overwhelmingly past retirement age. They need them to turn out. And prior to the election, it looked like a lot of them were going to stay home. So this is why they're leaning so hard into a number of policies. So they're leaning very hard into the anti-immigration rhetoric, which is, of course, not just them, the Labour Party's doing it as well. And that they hope that will secure them a better turnout from their voting base. They're now floating this idea, which even according to other members of Sunak's cabinet, was never discussed. Like, this was literally something that was pulled out of his arse a couple of days ago, following a meeting with his advisors, where I think he was told, look, you've got to basically lean all the way into like the stuff that the uber reactionary petty bourgeois voting base wants. Otherwise, they're going to go away and they're going to vote for reform, or they're not going to turn out, and then we will have a disaster. So this is the reason why I think Rishi Sunak has done it. Being a man who's thinking in the very short term, he's thinking he's probably going to lose, so he'd never have to pilot this idea to fruition anyway. So he might as well just throw this on the table in the hope that the Tory vote holds up and it doesn't either stay at home or defect to reform. Because the Tory election team have made a correct analysis on this point, which is that they've worked out that Labour's lead is not anything like as big as the polling companies are trying to lead us to believe. It's actually a shallower lead than we are given the impression that it is. And so if they can get their core vote out, if they can damage Labour just enough, then they're going to lose, but they're not going to lose by a country mile, and Starmer's government will be have quite a slim majority, or he'll end up having to put together a coalition which will be very unstable. And this is a point of view I share. So they have gone for this core vote strategy, which is what this is about. Now, that's the shallow level here, the shallow level that the Tory electoral team are sort of working on, where the angle that they're working. The other bigger picture stuff is that, of course, this has been a policy which has been demanded by various military chiefs in Britain. It's been demanded by the sort of harumphing right wing of the Conservative Party, personified by that whiny little pussy Tobias Ellwood, who cried because a bunch of pro-Palestine protesters did a entirely peaceful protest outside his residence after he'd been cheerily bellowing for genocide and nuclear war for the last 2 years. Turns out our beloved Member of Parliament, Mr. Ellwood, can't take the remotest amount of heat. But so they've been demanding it, the generals have been demanding it, it's been a topic of discussion. So is this something which is a serious idea? Are the strategists of the ruling class putting this out there to prepare for something big? Now, there's an argument to make to say that this is basically a trial balloon. They know that Sunak is probably going to lose. They know that this isn't going to be a popular idea. But, so why not have him go out there and float it and see how it goes down? Now, Starmer, so far, and you can never rely on him saying the same thing tomorrow as he said today, which is a different thing than what he said yesterday or indeed 2 hours ago. But he so far has refused to back it. He's basically hidden behind the idea that it's uncosted, it's untested, it's not going to be resourced properly, it's irresponsible, that kind of thing. So maybe some in the ruling class, and by the way, the ruling class are by no means united around this election, and they're by no means united around the way forward. Some of them, I think the bulk of them that are backing Starmer, want him to do specific things for them. And here we will get into where potential real risks are. But I think this idea is a non-starter, though. I think it's being part of the reason why they floated it is to see how it goes down. It's not going down particularly well. It may shore up the Tory core vote, or help to shore up the Tory core vote. Sunak will probably come out with some other things. I mean, he'll probably be coming back with reintroduction of the death penalty and dunking witches or something by the time this election's over. But the point is that I don't think this is a real risk for now of them bringing this in, partially because Sunak's not going to win, but also that, again, like, to actually build an army that could alter the Russians' military calculations in Ukraine would take them years. It's not just a matter of calling up 100,000 unwilling, surly 18-year-olds, having them parade round a square, learn to march, learn to fix bayonets and charge. I mean, this isn't 1914 anymore. I mean, any force they send over there would be turned into mincemeat in about 8 minutes. So the other point about this, though, is that can they even do the basics here? Can they even equip such a force? And also there is the point about, well, even if you got 100,000 men, it would take them 6 months to do basic infantry training, and then a year to have them brought up to speed on anything specialist. So it wouldn't just be a matter of throwing 100,000 infantry grunts at the Russian guns. It would be that you would have to take some of these guys and have to train them in other things as well. So 6 months basic training, followed by another 6 months of training on whatever the speciality is. And then there's the question of, well, how are you going to equip them? Does the British military defence infrastructure, the production base, actually have the capacity to equip a bigger army? So far, the answer appears to be no. And thus far, we haven't seen any real big effort to dramatically upscale production of military items. Now, they're saying they've got a new tank factory online. that will be producing the Challenger 3, which is essentially an upgraded Challenger 2. Okay, well, can they produce them at the rate that they will lose them if they were going to send them to Ukraine? No. Let's return to what we have talked about before, which is why is it that the idea of a 5-year pause has been floated by some European officials, and it's sort of been talked about and danced around by certain officials in the United States at certain points. That's because 5 years is the minimum period which they think that the Europeans will need to get their economies and societies into a place where they could have feasibly have some sort of military intervention against the Russians and not just get wiped out and destroyed. That's what the 5-year thing is about. The idea is, well, we'll freeze the conflict, pause for 5 years, then maybe the Russians won't notice that we've built up this huge military, and then maybe we can go in there and have a go. So to do the kind of drastic upgrading of the military industrial complex in this country, to do the drastic upgrading of the army, the navy, and the air force that would be required, first of all, it would require an enormous amount of expenditure. And bear in mind, one of the reasons they got rid of national service in this country 64 years ago is precisely because it was costing too much. They had to withdraw from what used to be called east of Suez, because again the British couldn't afford to keep the bases there. That's why they lent so hard into developing neo-colonialism, which is indirect control rather than direct control. So this is something which they can't afford to do, not without whacking up taxes massively, which they're already doing, which would again destabilize things. So the danger isn't, I don't think, an immediate march off to war in Ukraine. The British, the French, the Italians, the Germans, the Spanish, the rest of the European NATO countries don't have the capability to do that. So in all likelihood, the only ones who could conceivably do it would be the United States, and they've got severe problems as well. I mean, the maximum amount of regular troops they've got is what, 450,000? What, 1 million plus in like reserve and National Guard, perhaps? And they don't even have capacity to actually ship a lot of their stuff en masse in the numbers that would be required over to the European theatre of war. And if they've got a shiploads of stuff over there, well, then they have to contend with the Russian submarine fleet. So the numbers, the timescales, the production figures just don't add up for them being able to actually intervene in a meaningful way before the Russians carry through the plan they clearly now have for Ukraine. Now, the bigger risk is, and this goes to the point or the question that was raised by Tim Gray in the chat earlier on, what is the risk here? There are two risks. First of all, it's that they do get, if for some reason Putin and the Russian leadership just become incredibly stupid, or the comprador bourgeoisie in Russia has more influence than it has appeared to so far, if they did go for some stupid pause which left a sort of Bandera land in the west of Ukraine, which the West could then flood with arms and weapons, and they could spend 5 years uninterruptedly building up their military resources and wholly soaking their societies in propaganda, basically setting up martial law in their own countries and preparing things for a full-on war with the Russians. If they got 5 years to do that, but maybe they could pull something off. And that's a big maybe, though, because we're not even taking into account the fact that the productivity of the industries in our countries is very, very low in terms of the investment level is very low. The rate of profit is too low. It would take a gigantic state intervention measure to do anything like what would be required to pull this off. Now, so I think the bigger risk isn't that this plan is going to immediately go through and like Britain starts singing "Onward, Christian soldiers, marching us to war." No, the bigger risk for us, because considering that we're going to be getting a government led by Sir Keir Starmer, always important to give him his title, he did earn it after all. The bigger risk is that two things happen. First of all, Starmer's main purpose other than his overarching purpose is to use the Labour Party's connections with the trade union movement to be able to more effectively stick the boot in on the working class than the Tories could. That's always their purpose. But the purpose he's been brought in to achieve is to undo Brexit. Undo Brexit and get Britain back into the single market and back into the European infrastructure, one way or the other. Now, that's one mission that's been specifically given to him by the dominant factions in the British ruling class. Now, again, not all of the British ruling class are united about that, but the City of London very much wants it. And so that is his job. And it doesn't matter if Keir Starmer destroys his premiership and the Labour Party in the process, because give it 5 years or 3 years or however long this lasts, and the Tories will be ready to step back in again. So bear in mind what the historic purpose of the Labour Party is. The historic purpose of the Labour Party is to do the things that the Tories are either too corrupt, too divided, or too weak to do. So assuming this, by the way, this is why they want a strong Starmer government. Again, the risk for us isn't in the next year or so. The risk for us in terms of the ruling class marching off to a war against either Russia or China or Iran, as Rishi helpfully informed us of. But China is the bigger risk in terms of their objectives here. The risk is that it happens within 3 to 5 years, and that risk is compounded by a Labour Party government. And it's compounded by a Labour Party government that is strong enough to carry through these various things that the Tories cannot. One of which includes, of course, undoing Brexit for all the reasons we've talked about before. But another reason is, and this goes to a comment that Luca made in the chat about the debate in Italy being steered in the direction of the bringing back of national service there. So I thought you still had it over there. I'm obviously not up to date. But the only realistic, well, maybe not realistic, but the only way that the European powers can actually pull off reindustrialization and rearmament on a mass basis is probably if they try to do it as a collective. And this is an idea that Ursula von der Leyen, or as the Irish MEP Claire Daly calls her, Frau von Genocide, von der Leyen and others in the European hierarchy, and Macron have been coming up with this idea, and Macron's been pushing it for years. Various other French leaders have pushed the idea of the European Union having its own independent defence capacity. And this is something that previously the British were out to block because the American imperialists weren't keen on this. They didn't want the European Union to develop this capacity. They didn't want it to develop into a potential rival, and they successfully used the British connection to squash it. Now, the American imperialists might be thinking, well, or this is something that maybe Biden and Trump would agree on, is that they might be thinking, well, this isn't going particularly well over in Ukraine. Perhaps we'd be better off focusing on China. So let's let the Europeans carry this war on, and we'll slowly step away in a manner which isn't obvious as a defeat. So now we might be looking at the fact that we've got both Trump and Biden, whoever wins, whichever faction in the US ruling class wins out, both being more keen on the European powers spending more on defence and developing their own defence capacities. So again, I will return to what I think is the risk here. Starmer undoes Brexit, puts Britain almost by hook or by crook fully back into the European Union again. Again, it will be presented as in the following ways. We're in a crisis. Russia threatens all of Europe. Britain needs to stand with Europe. Where the crisis is military, it is economic, it is political. We need to be in there with our European partners. Brexit was the work of an irresponsible Tory party surrendering to right-wing nationalistic forces influenced by Putin. You can hear Keir Starmer saying this. And that's why we need to undo it. There's a crisis. We can't delay. We can't have a referendum. We must get this through. We'll do it via a vote in Parliament. Bear in mind, Starmer's committed over and over and over again that he's going to sort out Brexit. He's going to make the most of Brexit. Don't be surprised if he does with that promise what he's done with all of these other ones, which is that his actual plan will be, oh no, the crisis is too big. We can't stand aside from Europe. Britain must join this struggle. And just as just as Churchill did, we will stand and defend British democracy in Europe, or something like that. And you can just see the way this goes. Brexit gets undone, Britain goes back into Europe, and this time the US administration is all in favour of a European defence capacity, a European defence capability being upgraded. And so the danger is that they then try and do this. That national service isn't something that comes into Britain next year. It's something that is worked on relentlessly by the Labour Party in a pro-European fashion, by the way. This is why the Labour Party is the much more likely party to actually get away with bringing back national service than the Tories are. The Tories are dead in the water. If they manage to stave off a disaster, they'll be doing well. So the bigger danger, to reiterate the point I'm making here, is that it's the Labour Party that works on this idea relentlessly and wins over, or tries to win over, a section, or a big section, of the Labour voting petty bourgeoisie and Labour aristocracy to this idea. Got to stop the bad man Putin. Got to stop the damn Chinese commies taking over free and independent Taiwan. Got to, well, those are the two most likely options. Got to defend Israel. Well, that's a bit dodgy. They might not want to go there. But relentless focus on getting Britain back into the EU. Relentless focus on then developing an EU defence capacity. Bear in mind, the British government has already signed bilateral defence agreements with Poland and Ukraine. Now, they're not going to do jack shit for Ukraine in truth. But again, the bigger danger is then the European Union develops this defence capacity, or tries to, and after 5 years of relentless propaganda about this from the Labour Party and the liberal side of the British bourgeois, then the EU does develop this, or starts to develop it with a British contribution. And at the same time, we get like continent-wide propaganda against Russia, against China, and this anti-multipolar, shall we say, move from the Europeans. This is what comes into play, and I can see the British ruling class being more keen on that now. Bear in mind, there was always a section of them, a minority of them, that were keen on the idea of a European defence capacity. They lost out in the debate 20 years ago with the Atlanticist wing. Now, they might be unified around this idea now. They get to go back into the EU gets to develop more state-like structures, the EU starts developing a defence aspect, or a war-making aspect, shall we say. Of course, it's easier said than done. You know, you have many different countries in Europe with many different languages, many different military traditions. To actually try and stitch together some kind of like common defence production policy would take basically the EU developing almost a bureaucratic command economy. So again, this is no easy thing, but I think this is where the risk lies for us, not just in Britain but elsewhere. It's going to be a European project now to develop this, and the Labour Party is going to be they're going to be the salesman for this in Britain, and it will be done in a progressive way. You know, Starmer will do his flag waving and his marching up and down if his girdle can stand it, but it will be sold to the petty bourgeois liberals and leftists as, well, we have to go back into Europe, we have to help Europe develop, this is a progressive move, we're standing up to tyranny. You can imagine the way this will be sold. So Sunak floats the idea and loses. Starmer then spends the next few years preparing the ground for a common European approach to these things. Not to say that this won't face opposition, not to say these things will work, and I think it won't work. I think it'll be a disaster for them. But I think that's where the risk lies. It's much more with 3 to 5 years down the line rather than the immediate march off to war now. So we will now pause and take a look at who's in the chat before I'll go on to talk about a related issue. So, C. Bolt, good evening to you. Tim Gray asked this question. Is the National Service Plan just another step into preparing the population for a large-scale war with either Russia or China over the next year plus? Well, I hope I've answered that. I don't think it's about the next year plus or next year or so. I think it's about the next 5 years. That's the bigger issue for us. Gonzalo, greetings to you in perfidious Spain. Peter joins us from perfidious Albion. Greetings to you. Lee Hinchcliffe is with us, as is John Jeffers, joining us from London. Rob, good evening to you on the wrong side of the Pennines. Otis, who says good evening, and I say good evening back. Morgan enjoyed the switch in musical styles. Crez Casseroles says good evening from North London. And Michael joins us from West Belfast. Palestine will be free. Michael is correct. It will be. Tim Gray requests Go Home British Soldiers on the next playlist. I will look at... We may be doing some changing up of the playlist. We may be going for some more Anglo-revolutionary songs in the near future, mixing it up a little bit. Roddy, good evening to you. Davey joins us from Gwynedd. Austin says, do I recommend E.H. Carr's History of the Bolshevik Revolution? Well, I've not read all of it, so I can't comment. Some of his work on the planned economy was quite good. I'd recommend the first thing to read is actually the history of the CPSU, the Central Committee produced history of the party, which deals very comprehensively with the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution. And you can find that pretty easily on my own party's online store, so you can get it from there. Go to CPGBML website, you can get it through that. Abolish NATO says, greetings from New Jersey, and I greet you back again. Albert Roundtree says, there are a few old gits I would like to volunteer for national service. Well, I would volunteer the current Prime Minister, the current Leader of the Opposition, most of the Cabinet, and indeed most of the members of the British Parliament. I'll send them off in a crack squad to do a bayonet charge at the Russian lines, and we'll see how that goes. Luca, good evening to you. Beju, good evening to you, comrade. Brad Wall is with us. We've got... where are we? Good evening also to my comrade Terry Eaton, my comrade Rick. Two are joining us from the wrong end of the Mersey there. Dennis Curry is with us. Almir is with us. Makumi says, I was going to send the National Service clip from Yes Minister. Yeah, well, that one's, I think, even better. Colchester Ian is with us. Arnold is with us. Not a Pacifist joins us. Comrade Ian Foster is with us. Michael says, the compradors in Ireland pushing for the Free State to drop neutrality. Yeah, well, I would say that rapidly joining the compradors are Sinn Féin themselves, given their attitude towards NATO now. Heidi joins us. Reverend Ripple says, Galloway is going full anti-immigrant too. Yes, indeed he is. More on that in future episodes when we... Oh, by the way, just as I should tell you all, special live stream on Wednesday of this week, so that's tomorrow at 6 p.m. I'm going to be joining my comrades Rick and Chris with the Class Consciousness Project live stream. We're going to be talking about the election and related issues there, so come join us for that one on the Class Consciousness Project YouTube and Twitter channels to be advertised comprehensively across the course of tomorrow. Zarg05 is with us. RVA Klavek is with us from Detroit. Yeah, well, 876, hello to you. Jerry joins us and says, this looks like a gripping episode. I was going to go off to bed, but you're going to listen for a bit more now. Well, good to have you with us. Potted Rodent says, there's no one worth supporting in the United States. Marius joins us. Well, Marius points out that there's Jill Stein, who's the only decent choice. That's true. She's the only one who's taken a consistent stand on anything. Cornel West's campaign was, well, he turned it into a joke, to be completely honest. Eric says, so it sounds to me like the European Union with Britain will take the next steps trying to become a nation state rather than an alliance. They're going to try. I think it's going to be a disaster. They will try very hard to do this, but I think an economic collapse will also get in the way, and we don't know how things are going to shake out with regard to the China situation. But at this point, I should probably bring in the Russian plan for Ukraine, because I need to talk about that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to circle around to this again when I've reached the end of the comments here. Yep, X, good evening to you. I've received your emails. I will be replying to you as soon as I've had the chance to actually do some replies. If you've sent me an email over the course of the last few days, I haven't had a chance to reply to anything yet, but I will be doing over the next few days. Reverend Ripple says, isn't it too late for all this? Europe allowed the US to destroy the biggest economy by ending Germany's power supply. It may well be. That's why it's one of the reasons why it's not going to work. Ken Jack says, unpaid graft. He's going to send his daughters. You believe that and have a bridge to sell you. Well, they never. Well, the old ruling class used to send their some of their sons off to die horrifically in their wars. No way Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer sending any of his children now. The Green Party is pro-Palestine but pro-NATO stuff is bad, and I think it was a quick and sneaky decision. Green Party in this country is a right load of old shit, to be honest. Don't vote for it. Abtin says, joining you from the SPQR of Meloni. Greetings, comrades. Nikki Const is joining us from Paris. And we've got Harold joining us. Rick is at the Labour-occupied end of the Mersey. Well, this is also a Labour-occupied end of the Mersey. So really, there's nowhere else to... We're stuck between the worst one-party state in the world. Right, so to go back to the point I was making earlier about the Russian aim for Ukraine is actually becoming quite clear now, and we did discuss this on the last program before the weekend. The Russian plan for Ukraine is now coming into view more and more clearly, and it does involve former President Yanukovych, though I think his role will be strictly temporary, and it seems that they are prepared to take temporary control over all of previously what was previously Ukraine. Still some question marks over the West, but I really don't think they're going to allow the NATO countries to take that over and turn it into a Bandera theme park. So they are going to take all of it, which is the reason why, as others have mentioned, one of the reasons why they're not just carpet bombing and destroying everything, which is they want Ukraine to be a viable state after this war has come to its conclusion. Bear in mind, the original Russian objective was just to secure autonomy for Donetsk and Lugansk, and of course, Russian possession of Crimea. They weren't even going for Zaporozhye and Kherson originally, but those will have to be staying in Russia now. However, the Russian plan, it really does seem to be that they are going to recreate a viable Ukrainian state. And this is why there was talk of Yanukovych being in Belarus the other day. They now have the idea that they are going to put the reconstituted Ukraine, probably with Yanukovych and others who are in the Ukrainian government in exile, temporarily in charge before they can hold elections. They'll seek to Ukrainize the military situation there as rapidly as they can, and then get the new Ukrainian government to essentially sign a very similar deal that exists between that now exists between Belarus and Russia, which is the Union State Treaty. Now, there was consideration of a Union State Treaty with Ukraine way back in 97 to 98, but that was quashed by the first NATO accession talks. So this game's been going on for a long time. Now, previously, the Russian capitalist class, of course, weren't interested in war, as we've covered many times here before. It was only when they were backed into a corner that they finally had to suck it up and get on with it. But now a clear plan has emerged out of the Putin-led government, and that is to reconstitute a new Ukrainian state, or a new version of a Ukrainian state, declare that everything after 2014 was illegitimate, occupy Ukraine for long enough to stamp out the Banderist elements in the country, basically do a giant purge, put a load of people on trial, The Banderists that don't flee to the United States and Europe will either end up dead or in a Russian prison. They'll reconstitute a government and they'll hold elections when they're good and ready, and they'll then get the Yanukovych government that is probably going to be reconstituted to sign a union state treaty to essentially bring all of Ukraine into a union state arrangement with a unified, or at least very heavily integrated military force, the same way that they're integrating the Belarusian armed forces into a union state force. They'll do the same with a reconstituted and cleansed Ukrainian army. I mean, this, if you look at what they did with Chechnya 20 years ago now, again, similar, some things can be learned from that, which is that the Russians like to localize a solution as much as they possibly can, and pull the Russian security forces back. So back then it was having Akhmat Kadyrov deal with it until he was killed, and then have his son Ramzan Kadyrov take over the running of Chechnya as a constituent republic of the Russian Federation. Now it'll be having Yanukovych and others step in to a reconstituted Ukraine that will be built up by the Russians to be to inherit Ukrainian statehood, to retake the Ukrainian place in all the international institutions, but any talk of the EU or NATO membership is gone, and this will now be incorporated into a union state treaty. So its military will be integrated into a common structure with Belarus and Russia. You may have Russian nuclear weapons ending up back in Ukraine again. So one of Zelensky's whinges about the withdrawal of the nuclear weapons in 1994, well, he'll get that addressed. Russian nuclear weapons may end up back in Ukraine again. And then, of course, the question of the regions won't matter as much once all of this has been done. Now, this will be a difficult process for them to pull off, because first of all, they have to defeat this version of the Ukrainian regime. They have to make sure that the NATO forces don't do anything stupid, like trying to put forces in one place in Ukraine or another. Putin made it fairly clear in some comments he made in his state visit to Uzbekistan that they are going to be, that they're unafraid to basically wipe out anybody who goes in there. And so I think that we can expect the war to be brought to a close at some point by the end of this year. The question is just, will the Russians bring it to a close dramatically, or will they just keep the pressure on until the Ukrainian state just buckles and collapses, which it looks like it's going to. The big idea that the Americans have, which is what Blinken was babbling about at the House of Representatives hearing the other day, and it was his appearance in the Senate that he was talking about this. When he was saying that, well, we're going to let Ukraine fire on any target it wants inside Russia. That's their big idea. To bolster Zelensky by making him look as if he's winning something by blowing up a Russian radar installation or something. Again, just a cynical tactic to spin the war out. I mean, the American military know that the war is lost. They have no intention of getting involved directly. The only plan is to keep the wheels spinning, keep Zelensky viable for as long as possible, in the hope that either something turns up, but I don't think they really hope that anymore, or at least that it gets to the point where the war's gone on so long it's kind of forgotten. So when it does fall apart, you can just dump it on the Europeans and turn and make your pivot over to doing whatever the hell it is that they're planning to do regarding Taiwan, which I don't think will work either, by the way. So interesting developments with regard to with regard to Russia and Ukraine. It's also interesting that one of the objectives of Putin's visit to Uzbekistan is, of course, economic integration of Uzbekistan fully into the Eurasian Economic Union, but also apparently trying to persuade Uzbekistan into the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And there was seemingly some steps towards that. The relations between Mirziyoyev, the president of Uzbekistan, and Putin seem to be going quite well. Uzbekistan previously had been a little bit distant. It has had close relations with the imperialist powers. So it's an interesting one. But clearly the plan of the Russians is to integrate the post-Soviet states more and more. If they get their way in Ukraine, which I think they will then have the old three sisters, Belarus, Ukraine and Russia, back together again. And the Americans will shout and scream and stamp their feet, but eventually they're going to have to just swallow this one. They lost. And they are going to try and do as much as they can without committing their own forces to cost the Russians as much as possible. But they know that this game is up. The bigger danger here is that then somebody tries something very silly with regard to Taiwan. Either telling the Taiwanese compradors, well, go for it, we've got your back all the way. But of course, the defeat in Ukraine will have bigger consequences, because even comprador regimes will start looking at it and going, do we really want to end up like Zelensky's ended up? Because I don't think his face is going to be particularly favourable in the end. So this is the plan. There is clearly a plan in place for post-conflict Ukraine now, which involves the Russians restoring a version of the Ukrainian state and binding it into near unbreakable treaties with Russia itself. Okay, so let's go back to the comments here. PSL is full of radlibs, says Marius, and Marius is right. I am JK says, per Dima of the Military Summary Channel, Putin no longer recognizes Zelensky as president of Ukraine and instead will deal with the head of Ukraine's parliament. I saw that video. That's not what Putin said, because I saw Putin's comments as well. What Putin said was that Zelensky no longer has a claim on legitimacy, and according to the constitution of Ukraine, as it currently stands, then the office of president should go to the Speaker of the Parliament. Now, he didn't say, I'm now going to deal with the Speaker of the Parliament. That's not what he said, because that's not what he'll be doing either. He's not going to deal with the Speaker of the Parliament either. Now, the only thing that the Speaker of the Parliament could do is to sign an unconditional surrender, which, whoever the hell that is, I don't think they're going to do that. So the Military Summary Channel, again, has a lot of good information on it, but I think he tends to get a little bit carried away at times, because he does says some pretty wild things from time to time that turn out not to be true. So I think with this one, he's taken some comments that Putin made slightly out of context. It's not hard to get on the PSL makeup, but the platform seems to tick all the boxes. PSL are basically a Trotskyite organization who cosplay periodically as communists. Their politics are roughly, they're a little bit more, they appear to be a bit more Marxist-Leninist than your average Trotskyite group in Britain. But if you examine the platform, it looks good. But then you examine the practice and the composition of the organization, and it's Trotskyite through and through. It's like they're into every radical liberal identity politics piece of bullshit you could possibly find. Their understanding of Leninism is non-existent. I've seen their people advocate voting for the Democrats before. So they are a Trotskyite and opportunist organization, the PSL. You want to vote for Claudia de la Cruz as a protest candidate? Okay, fair enough. But don't think that the PSL is anything other than essentially an organization which is a Trotskyite bunch of opportunists, which is what it is. It gets in the way of building anything positive in the United States. It doesn't enable it. So I would say platform is one thing. Actual political practice reveals the truth, which is that the PSL is an ultra-leftist and opportunist organization, the same way that all Trotskyite groups are. Beju says, it seems that whatever the outcome of the SMO in Ukraine, the ruling class are gearing towards war anyway. The inevitable end stages of imperialism. That's very true. They've got a lot of difficulties, though, in doing so. Now, I'll come to how they might try and address those in just a moment. And, of course, we have the opportunity to change this particular course of events. More on that in future episodes. Greetings to Brian in Dublin, who's catching your first live stream in ages. Good to have you with us. Kobe says it's generally annoying when other leftist groups make things like LGBT rights as a strings attached issue. Just sort of reeks of narcissism. Yeah, and that's true here. I mean, you've got various groups trying to like block people from the WPB from speaking. Now, I'm no longer, of course, left a while ago. The WPB have a lot of criticisms of its platform and the criticisms of Galloway, but the reason why Trotskyites are now trying to cancel Galloway is nothing to do with developing a decent critique of the politics of the WPB. It's opportunism and pandering to identity politics. That's why they're trying to cancel Galloway. And to be fair, they're trying to stop him speaking on Palestine, pro-Palestine platforms. The only people that benefits isn't, a revolutionary perspective. It benefits the Labour Party, and a lot of the Palestine activism in Britain, despite the fact it's very well supported, is still run by a combination of Trotskyites and Labour Party people who are determined to run the whole thing into the ground. Will Rojava survive? Well, that's a whole program right there. Yeah, well, 876. The only chance that enclave has of surviving is as an autonomous region within Syria. If they try and if the SDF continues to serve US imperialism, they're going to get crushed by it'll end up being crushed by the Syrians themselves or Erdogan or some combination of the two. Michael says, Taiwan youth are totally brainwashed. Well, if that's the case, then, I don't know that situation as well as you might. I will need to research more into it. But to get a country to go into the mode that Ukraine has gone into, then you need a totally brainwashed population. That's correct. How will the collapse of the Ukrainian army happen? Asks Luca. My guess, and this is a guess, is that the Russians will continue to press on them and annihilate their best units, stretch their front line as much as they possibly can. But eventually, there's already reliable reports coming from some Russian reporters that they're chucking in men who've had like barely a week-long training course into the front line to soak up bullets, basically. Eventually, more and more, and this will happen quite soon, Ukrainian army units are just going to surrender, just going to give up, and won't be just men on the front line. You're going to end up with commanders surrendering. So eventually, what's going to happen is that I think eventually somebody will present Zelensky with an ultimatum. Maybe the Ukrainian military commanders. Maybe somebody else. Zelensky's power now is based on two things. The fact that the Americans and the British still back him, and the fact that he has the intelligence service of Ukraine at his disposal. Eventually, though, I think we'll get to the point where so many individual Ukrainian army units are just either deserting or surrendering that the front line will start to buckle and then collapse. And then at that point, somebody will put a question to Zelensky, shall we say, which is, look, this is falling apart. What do we do? And he won't know, of course, because he's just an actor. And at that point, Zelensky may flee. I don't think the Americans will want him to flee. I think the Americans will want him to go down with the ship. He's more used to them dead than alive now, but he'll want out. Whether he'll be allowed to get out is another question. Zelensky will eventually be removed or will flee. There will be some kind of conflict possibly between the Ukrainian army high command and the intelligence services, or maybe if Zelensky quits, then the whole thing just implodes. But either way, it's probably going to be Ukrainian army commanders that end up surrendering to the Russian forces due to mass defections and the inability to train new men. And if that happens, then what will probably happen in response to that, when it becomes clear that they can't hold and that the whole thing's falling apart, at that point, my guess is, and again, this is just guesswork, that's the point where you will see the Russians start to move very, very quickly across the rest of Ukraine. So to secure all of it, if they want to secure all of it, they'll have to move to seal off like the Polish border and the other borders with the NATO states, and they'll have to move very quickly to seize the key areas. They probably have a plan in place now. They have a hell of a lot of men in Belarus, for instance, waiting there for something to happen. And then once you get the start, what I think that what a lot of those men are there to do is to move quickly on Kiev and on Lvov, and ultimately they'll need to go to Odessa when the collapse comes. So I think what a lot of those men are there to do is to do that rapid maneuvers when the things are collapsing, move as quickly as they can across the countryside. Maybe, I don't know, they'll do like airborne landings or something like that if the opposition's completely collapsed, rapidly take control of the key cities, seal off the border area, and basically then finish off whatever Banderite elements want to continue fighting. And then once you've done that, then you'd have to make sure the rest of the country's tied up and secured, that NATO doesn't get any funny ideas about landing a force in there or anything like that. So to reiterate the point of answering Luca's question, I mean, it'll be bit by bit and then all at once. And as to timelines, I think it'll be over by, and you can call me up on this if I'm wrong, probably by October. It'll be all done, which it's certainly the end of the year. I would say end of the autumn will be the moment that it will all be, the collapse will happen. End of the year, beginning of next year, you'll see the Russians controlling most of what is now Ukraine, and chaos will then break out across the European Union and Britain when it becomes obvious just how bad things are. Has Rojava already had a revolution? Well, asks. No, they've not. Do I think Marxist-Leninists have unfinished business there? I don't think we've got any business there, to be honest. I don't think we ever had any business there. I know that some went there from Turks and various others to actually fight against ISIS. But bear in mind, now, both the SDF and ISIS always were, are creatures of US imperialism. So the whole Rojava thing was marketed by Trotskyites and anarchists and others in the West as some sort of great revolution. But in reality, that process got swallowed up by US imperialism. The only way that the Kurdish population is going to get a good deal now is if they deal with the Damascus government. Because if they allow their leadership to continue to make them tools of a US occupation, that is going to end incredibly badly. Just look at the fate of those who've served British imperialism in the region in the past. So the British employed the Assyrians as essentially a militarized section of the population that would aid British occupation of Iraq. That didn't end well for the Assyrians in Iraq. It enabled their enemies inside Iraq to disparage and whip up hatred against them for many years. Won't end well for the Kurds either unless they renounce the relationship with the US imperialists and, again, reach an arrangement with the Damascus government. That's the only way forward. Eric says, expect a lot of propaganda about how Putin is reconstituting the USSR and how we have to help the stands, which will be painted as the next victim slated for incorporation via union treaties. I expect that they will try that. It's not going to work, though, because in the end, The British have a considerable footprint in Kazakhstan, so they can make a fair bit of trouble there. The Kazakhstan leadership is also rather shaky, so we can expect this. But ultimately, the defeat in Ukraine and the growing importance of the Eurasian Economic Union, and of course the relationship with the Chinese, is going to make it so that even these shaky comprador types in the stands are going to think, well, we're better off going with our number one trading partner. Because in the end, Britain is a long way away. The Americans are even further away. Europe is a long way away. In practical terms, yes, the British and the Americans and the Europeans have had a good run exploiting the resources of these countries and trying to subordinate them into the empire. But this hasn't really worked, because you can't replace that Russian trading relationship, and it's only getting bigger now, which is why the Uzbeks are getting closer to the Russians now. So eventually, again, if this plan that the Russians have now clearly got for Ukraine works out, we can expect that process to speed up and the imperialists to end up losing even more in the Central Asian region. There's also a strong hint from Medvedev that the Russians are getting close to recognizing the Taliban as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. So there was, of course, a lot of concerns from the Central Asian republics about that. Looks like the Russians have been working overtime with all the interested parties to try and reach an arrangement. So if that is the case, then the Russians have reached a satisfactory deal, as they would see it, with the Taliban to secure the Afghan border. They'll probably assist the Taliban, if they need it, in crushing whatever the hell it is that the US is trying to run in Afghanistan, ISIS-K or whatever the hell it's called now, and the other rebels, and they'll get to work on incorporating Afghanistan into the Eurasian space. And the Taliban will go along with it, because now their legitimacy doesn't lie in recognition by Washington, it lies in recognition by Moscow and Beijing and the surrounding Central Asian states, who will want a lot of guarantees, and of course that'll force the Taliban into a more regularized form of government. Lumpen Lodge says, wasn't Brian Becker, founder of PSL, didn't he work for InfoWars and Alex Jones? I have no idea. I am not familiar with that at all. If you've got evidence of that, please post it, because that would be quite funny. Zargo5 says, constant attrition of Ukrainian forces. Lines will collapse soon. 500 to 600,000 already dead. Must be 1 million casualties on top of that. Yeah, it's just a question of how long that the Americans can prop it up. I don't think it'll. Maybe my prediction's actually too conservative. We'll have to see. What's the issue with Becker? Only known from Breakthrough News. My issue is the PSL. PSL play the same role in America that the Trotskyite groups do here, which is that they sound very revolutionary, but always act in the most sectarian and divisive way possible. And that's their purpose. It's the reason why the British state allows, not only allows Trotskyites to exist, but actively promotes them. They actively promote this new, rebranded Trotskyite group in Britain. They give them favourable coverage. They put their members on big news platforms, and their numbers and their influence doesn't justify that. The Trotskyites play a very valuable role in that they are represented as the revolutionary force in the country. They get particularly disenchanted or potentially radical students to join them. These students get worked to the bone for a few years by these organisations. They get their heads filled with contradictory anti-Marxist shite disguised as Marxism. Eventually they drop out, very embittered and angry at what they feel has been a waste of their time, and the Trotskyite organisation moves on to the next generation to fill their heads full of shite. That's what the PSL does in America. It's what the Trotskyite groups do here. Will Zelensky survive physically? Well, I wouldn't want to speculate on that. He will be desperate to get to that villa in Miami. His survival physically far more depends on the Americans than it does the Russians. The Russians would love to get him and put him on trial. He won't want that. So when things start to go really wrong, the question is, do the Americans and the British see value in extracting him and having him live on as president in exile, maybe crying on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart or dancing a jig with Stephen Colbert? The question of his survival is really in the hands of his patrons. The Russians will want him alive. The Russians will want to put him on trial. Again, the British and the Americans won't want that. He might start talking. So it depends. What do his sponsors have in mind for him? What do they see him as having the most value for them? How do they see his fate as having the most value for them? Do they see it as more value for them if he's in exile, or more value for them if he's a martyr for democracy? This is interesting. Zarg says Zelensky is a dead man walking. Military coup, Russian trial, or if he's really lucky, he'll escape to his mansion in Florida unless the CIA nobble him. Good point. Licorice joins us and says, good morning from the British royal appendage of Aotearoa. You're going to have to tell me where that is. Is it, I'm guessing, considering you're saying good morning, that we are dealing with an Antipodean comrade. But let me know. Is that New Zealand? Am I guessing that right? Almir says it is going to be Bagration 2024 version. Well, when the collapse comes, as I said, they'll have to move very, very quickly to secure the rest of the country. David Greenwood, good evening to you. Right, okay, so I was going to cover some comments made, some very interesting comments made by Gennady Zyuganov at a recent meeting of the KPRF. So, but I'm out of time for tonight. So what I'm going to do is I'll put that into tomorrow's program. So we'll lead on tomorrow's program with the KPRF's recent analysis of the situation. And we'll then move into an update on what's going on in occupied Palestine. So, thank you to all 325 of you who have tuned in thus far, 184 of you on X, and 142 of you on YouTube. So, you will be able to find the audio version of this on Patreon from tomorrow. Thank you to all patrons who support this program and make it possible. And if you want to join the Patreon, you can find the links in the show description. Recent Patreon content included the review of the 1987 classic RoboCop. So, again, thanks to everybody who's tuned in. I'll be back with you, same time, same place tomorrow. Throw you back over now to a musical outro.
When I was young, I used to be as fine a man as ever you'd see in the Prince of Wales. He said to me, come and join the British Army. Tooraloo, they're looking for monkeys up at the zoo. It says, one, if I had a face like you, I'd join the British Army. Sarah Connon baked a cake, and so for poor old Slattery sake, sure I threw myself into the lake, pretending I was balmy. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army. Sergeant Healy went away and his wife got in the family way, and the only words that she could say was blame the British Army. Tooraloo, me curse upon the Labour crew that took me darling boy from me to join the British Army. Corporal Sheen is a terrible note, just give him a couple of jars of stout and he beat the enemy with his mouth and saved the British Army. Tooraloo, I've made me mind up what to do. Now I'll work me ticket home to you and the British Army.